The small house on Carolina Street in Gary, Indiana, looked ordinary. White siding, a sagging porch, and a street lamp that flickered at night. But inside those walls, Latoya Ammons and her 3 children were about to experience something so disturbing, it would blur the line between crime and the supernatural. They had moved in during the dead of winter. The air inside was cold, unnaturally so, even with the heat on. Rosa Campbell, Latoya's mother, helped unpack boxes, and almost immediately she felt uneasy. It wasn't the creaking floors or the faint smell of mildew. It was the heavy stillness that pressed down on the house like a weight. The first signs seemed harmless enough. Wet footprints tracked across the living room floor when no one had entered. Latoya wiped them away, but minutes later they returned, leading toward the basement. The children whispered about a shadow man they had seen standing in doorways, watching, always watching. One night, Rosa heard a thud from her bedroom. She opened her eyes and froze. At the foot of her bed stood a tall figure, darker than the darkness around it. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. She blinked, and it was gone. The sheets were damp with sweat, and her chest pounded as though she'd been running. The activity escalated quickly. Dishes rattled in cupboards. Doors opened and slammed with a force that shook the frames. The children complained of unseen hands tugging at their clothes, yanking them awake at night. Latoya brushed it off at first, convincing herself it was stress, an old house settling. But then came the bruises. Her youngest son woke one morning with deep purple marks circling his wrists, as though someone had grabbed him. No one in the family could explain it. The middle child complained of sharp pains in his stomach, but doctors found nothing wrong. Latoya began to fear they were living in something far worse than a haunted house. Then came the levitation. It was during a sleepover when her 12-year-old daughter suddenly rose from her bed, her body stiff as a board. Friends screamed as Rosa and Latoya rushed into the room, pulling her down. The girl had no memory of the event, but her mother's fear deepened. This wasn't a nightmare. This was real. At night, the family could hear voices whispering from the basement. Sometimes, the children's toys activated by themselves, mechanical laughter filling the air when no batteries were inside. Latoya, desperate, sprinkled salt and sage around the house. But the atmosphere grew darker, heavier. It was as if something inside the walls fed on their fear. Finally, Rosa and Latoya made the call that changed everything. They dialed the police, not to report a break-in, but to report the impossible. Officers were skeptical, but when they stepped into that house, they would leave with stories they would never forget. 2 uniformed officers arrived on a gray Indiana afternoon. Their boots crunched across icy gravel as they approached the Ammons house. They expected to find a frightened family exaggerating strange noises. Instead, the moment they crossed the threshold, both officers exchanged a glance. The house was unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that prickles your skin. Inside, Rosa explained the strange events. Footsteps in the basement, voices, children scratched and bruised. One officer chuckled, shaking his head. But as they walked through the living room, the laughter stopped. On the blinds, faint but visible, were oily handprints. Too high for the children to reach. The officer touched one. The greasy residue clung to his fingers. They descended into the basement, flashlights cutting across concrete walls. The beam landed on a patch of dirt floor near the center, where the concrete abruptly ended. "Why is it like this?" one officer asked. Rosa admitted she didn't know. The unfinished patch looked like a grave. Cold air seeped from it, sharper than the chill above. As they stood there, something slammed upstairs. Both officers bolted up, guns drawn. In the kitchen, the blinds were swinging violently, as though someone had just yanked them. But no one else was in the house. Their reports later noted movement without cause, though they never said the word paranormal. When the police left, the family felt abandoned. The events grew worse. The children began speaking in low, guttural voices that didn't sound like their own. At school, teachers reported sudden violent outbursts, blank stares, and disturbing drawings of dark figures. The Department of Child Services was called in to investigate possible abuse. During one visit, a DCS caseworker named Valerie Washington witnessed something that would end up in her official report. The youngest boy glared at his brother with black, unblinking eyes. Then, in full view of the worker, the boy walked backward up a wall. His body arched like a spider, his feet clinging to plaster. He flipped over his grandmother's head and landed upright on the floor. Everyone screamed. The caseworker rushed out, shaken and pale. "I'll never go back in there," she later said. But her statement was documented. A social service professional had put in writing what police would later confirm. This family was experiencing something unnatural. Doctors at the local hospital tried to explain the bruises and sudden changes in the children. They ran tests, but results came back normal. One physician, skeptical, suggested schizophrenia or delusional disorder, but that didn't explain the physical injuries. Nor did it explain why multiple unrelated witnesses, officers, teachers, doctors, were all reporting the same impossible events. Captain Charles Austin of the Gary Police Department was called in. He was a seasoned veteran, not the type to believe in ghost stories. But curiosity brought him to the Ammons house. He carried a small recorder, intent on documenting everything. Hours later, when he played back his notes, he froze. A deep, growling voice echoed on the tape, words no one had heard in real time. The official investigation was now tangled. Child Services suspected abuse, yet witnesses were reporting levitation, wall walking, and voices. Police were documenting disturbances without intruders. Doctors were baffled. The Ammons case sat at the crossroads of true crime and something darker, and it was about to spiral even further. Word spread fast. A mother's haunted house was nothing new in urban legends, but this case had police reports, medical documentation, and child service records attached. Journalists started knocking on doors. Neighbors whispered that the Carolina Street home was cursed. Some swore they saw shadowy figures pacing the windows when the house was empty. Latoya, desperate and terrified, sought help from local churches. Most dismissed her. But one priest, Reverend Michael Maginot, agreed to visit. The moment he entered, he claimed the air thickened. He sprinkled holy water across the living room. The children shrieked, covering their ears, as if the sound of his prayers burned them. Maginot conducted a blessing, a minor exorcism ritual. He instructed the family to fast and pray. Yet the nights grew worse. The children woke with claw-like scratches down their backs. Rosa reported hearing something pound from the inside of the basement floor, as if trapped beneath the dirt patch the police had noted earlier. Captain Charles Austin returned with other officers to collect more evidence. They walked through the house with cameras. In the basement, their equipment malfunctioned. Flashlights dimmed, batteries drained instantly. Later, reviewing their photos, they discovered a blurred figure standing in the corner, tall, with glowing eyes. None of them remembered seeing it in person. The case began to feel less like a haunting and more like a crime scene. Police documented oily handprints appearing on blinds after being cleaned. They recorded voices, guttural and inhuman, whispering in empty rooms. Officers who mocked the events during the day refused to return at night. Meanwhile, the children grew more disturbed. Teachers called Latoya in tears, reporting violent tantrums and self-harm. One boy attempted to strangle his brother with invisible hands, insisting, "It told me to." Another wrote phrases in Latin on his schoolwork, though he had never studied the language. Medical staff again evaluated the family, suspecting psychological issues. But as they prepared paperwork, a nurse heard heavy footsteps pounding the hallway outside their office. When she opened the door, the corridor was empty. Yet the sound of running continued, fading only when she re-entered the room. Reverend Maginot escalated his efforts. He petitioned the Diocese of Gary for permission to perform an official exorcism, the first in the area in decades. The church was reluctant, but with multiple police officers and a DCS caseworker confirming strange activity, the request was granted. The ritual began in a small room with Latoya. Maginot placed a crucifix in her hands and began prayers in Latin. She convulsed, her eyes rolling back. A deep voice, not her own, growled, "Leave her. She is ours." Witnesses described the temperature dropping sharply, their breath fogging in the air. It took 3 sessions, each one violent. Latoya thrashed, cursed, and screamed in voices that shifted from childlike to guttural. The children cried in terror. Rosa prayed, clutching her rosary until her knuckles went white. At last, after weeks of ritual, Maginot declared the house cleansed. But even then, the officers who returned for follow-ups insisted the house was not empty. In recordings, strange whispers bled through static. Shadows moved against the light. No human suspect was ever found, no logical explanation documented. What remained was fear, and evidence that refused to make sense. By now, the Ammons house had a name: the Demon House. The story spread nationwide, picked up by newspapers and television. Skeptics called it a hoax. Believers called it proof of evil. But for the officers, doctors, and caseworkers who stepped inside, the memories never faded. The house stood silent again, but silence didn't mean peace. Latoya had moved her children temporarily to stay with friends. Yet even away from Carolina Street, the children still screamed at night. They claimed shadows followed them, whispering their names, tugging at their blankets. The evil, it seemed, was not bound to the house. One night, the youngest boy woke with a piercing scream. Latoya rushed to his room, only to freeze in horror. The wooden bed frame bore deep scratches, as if claws had gouged into it while the boy slept. His fingernails were short and unbroken, his hands clean. The marks were fresh, the wood splintering under her touch. A detective was called back to document the damage. He snapped photographs, shining his flashlight across the grooves. "No way this was made by a kid," he muttered. But he offered no other explanation. In his official notes, he described the scratches as inconsistent with human activity. Despite the exorcisms, despite the church's blessing, the atmosphere inside the Carolina Street house remained heavy. Officers refused to stand guard inside. One patrolman admitted he sat in his car across the street rather than enter. "You can feel it staring at you," he later confessed. The Department of Child Services, unable to reconcile medical findings with supernatural claims, eventually removed the children from Latoya's custody temporarily. They argued it was neglect, maybe mental illness. But when the children were evaluated again, this time far from the house, the violent episodes stopped. The bruises healed. The guttural voices went silent. Still, Rosa swore the house itself was alive, feeding on whoever dared step inside. Neighbors reported seeing figures pacing in the upstairs windows long after the family had left. Some nights, cars would slow on Carolina Street as drivers swore they saw shadows move across the porch. Captain Austin, a hardened veteran of the force, admitted years later that the case haunted him. He kept the audio tape of his visit, the one with the deep growl recorded over his notes. He played it only once more, in the quiet of his office, before locking it away in a drawer. "I don't need proof," he said. "I heard it myself." The house eventually changed owners. Some refused to live there at all, abandoning it after a few weeks. In 2014, it was purchased by a documentary filmmaker, who demolished it after claiming the energy inside was too dangerous to leave standing. Yet even its destruction couldn't erase the memory. To this day, the Ammons case remains one of the most well-documented hauntings in American history. Police, doctors, social workers, all credible witnesses, signed their names to events that science could not explain. A boy walking backwards up a wall. Voices captured on tape. Bruises appearing overnight. The final word came not from a priest or a police officer, but from Latoya herself. Years after leaving, she told an interviewer, "People can call me crazy, but they weren't there. They didn't hear it. They didn't see my babies thrown across the room. They didn't feel it breathing down their neck." And so, the story ends where it began, with a house on a quiet Indiana street. White siding, a sagging porch, nothing remarkable from the outside. But for those who stepped through its doors, it was a place where the natural and the supernatural collided, where crime scenes collected evidence that refused to obey the laws of reality. Even today, locals warn children not to walk too close to the empty lot where the house once stood. At dusk, some swear they still hear faint laughter, high-pitched and cruel, drifting on the wind. The ground is bare, but the fear remains. This was not just a haunting. It was not just a crime scene. It was something in between, something that left officers, doctors, and believers alike asking the same chilling question. If this is real, what else walks among us? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends so they can enjoy it too.